What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Fox Body Phantom channel, and today we're going to have some fun. We're going to talk about the 15 coolest cars from the 1980s. You know, I went through and I looked at a bunch of lists: Car and Driver, Road and Track, Sports Car Digest. There's a ton of cool stuff out there, but I think it's kind of iconic cars of the 80s. It was a lot about style, a lot about flash. Performance wasn't quite back to where, obviously, the unbelievable point that we are today. But there was just so many cool cars that came out of that era that I wanted to just take a few minutes and share it. I was going to do 10 of the coolest cars, and then I started making my list, and I was like, I can't limit it to 10 because there's a lot of really cool cars that I think sometimes get forgotten. And I'm going to be honest, there's probably 3 or 4 cars on here that I'm going to forget that are definitely honorable mentions to me. So I'll try to throw some honorable mentions in the beginning here, and then we'll go through our list and share some of the coolest cars of the 1980s. Hopefully you agree with us, and if you don't, throw your comments down below. Let us know what you think of the coolest cars of the 1980s. So let me hit 3 quick honorable mentions that I wanted to talk about on here that I thought were really cool cars. Actually, be 4. The first is the Mitsubishi Starion Chrysler Conquest. Man, when I was at high school, one of the kids at school had one, and I loved that car. I thought it was just such a cool looking car. It kind of popped up the first time you saw it was in the second Cannonball Run movie with Jackie Chan driving it. But man, what a cool car. You know, futurist design, all those weird, crazy angles. I love that car. The second we'll talk about is some of the tuner cars from the 80s. So that's why I said there could be like 3 or 4 in here. But you think about like the rough Porsche, the Yellowbird, the Callaway Corvettes, the Saline Mustangs, all the really cool tuner cars. I try to stay away from that in the list because there's a ton out there, but those cars were really incredibly cool. And I absolutely loved them. Thought they were really neat, kind of different cars. And that Pontiac had a Grand Prix 2+2, which was kind of this funky design for NASCAR. And we're actually funny, we're going to hit on all the other GM cars of that body style, but we left the Pontiac 2+2 out, but we can't. It's still a cool car, although incredibly anemic at like 160 or 170 horsepower, but still a neat car. So let's get on to number 15 on our list. So for number 15, we're going to have the 1984, specifically C4 Corvette. This car was a game changer. I was just reading Car and Driver's article about this car, and they were talking about how this car was a game changer. It had pulled the highest G's it ever pulled from a production car at .90, which the second best was a Porsche 928 at .82. It was 0 to 60 in under 7 seconds, which was a huge improvement from the 82s. You had that 68 to 82 body frame for us for a long time, and by the end, they were really anemic, no power, tons of emissions issues. And 84 wasn't the best version with the crossfire injection and that Doug Nash 4+3 manual, but man, it was a game changer in the car industry, and it absolutely changed the trajectory for what Corvette would do over the next, honestly, from 84 on. I mean, the cars became world class. They'd win a tons of races, and just become this great iconic car. And the cool thing about a C4 is I just had one. You can get one for relatively cheap. Great value for performance. They still look great. They're actually a really comfortable cruising car on the highway. The only downside is they're kind of expensive to fix if stuff goes wrong. And stuff will go wrong because there's a ton of technology in there. And they're not easy to get in and out of, if you ask my wife. Number 14, the Porsche 928, the car that was supposed to take out the 911. If you don't know, Porsche wanted to kill the 911. The 928 was supposed to be the flagship and take that car out. And Porsche enthusiasts would tell you, thank you that it didn't. But I love the 928. And if you grew up like I did, you watched Risky Business, and the 928 was the coolest car. Joel takes the car from his dad, gets out there, and wrecks it, and then that kind of all the chaos ensues afterwards. But what a beautiful car. I still love this car to this day. The pop-up headlights, even though they're exposed, the V8 front engine, V8, rear drive, automatic or manual transmission. Just a cool car from a technology. What a great GT car, right? An amazing cruiser. And again, these were cheap back in the day. I almost bought one, years ago for like $5,000, and now the values are starting to creep up. I saw a GTS on Bring a Trailer for like $140,000. So they're starting to creep up in value, especially if you get to the later, the late versions of these in the early 90s in the GTS form, when they had a ton of horsepower and real performance to go behind it. But just from a cool standpoint, again, man, Risky Business, beautiful style, pop-up headlights. I mean, everything you could ask for in an iconic 80s car. What else could you look for? So let's go on to number 13. All right, number 13, specifically the Pontiac Firebird Formula 350. man, I have a love-hate relationship with this car. I think this car is really cool looking. I actually think it's like the second best looking Trans Am of the 80s. You know, the early 80s Trans Am still had a little bit of that Bandit Trans Am in it, but again, I'm not a huge fan. They were kind of dogs. They had lost a lot of their performance edge. They were doing like the 301 turbos by the end that were really dogs. But then when you got into like the 87, 88 Formula Firebird, especially the 350, T-tops, really cool colors. My buddy Scott in the Army had a blue one when I had my white 5.0. And that was the first car that ever beat me in a race, and it was very frustrating. And he doesn't know it or not, but all these years later, I put a lot of money into that car because of that race that him and I had. But that car was iconic, you know. And again, you see them a lot in red. If you can find that light blue, they're really cool. Their version of kind of a turbine type wheel. But again, with blue with the T-tops, that turbine wheel, really sharp looking car, and in my opinion, the best looking of those 80s Pontiac Trans Ams, -1, which we'll get to further up in the list. But without further ado, we're going to jump on to number 12. Is going to be a car that was everywhere when I was a kid. And when I say that, I mean that. I mean, from a performance car, and again, performance in 80s terms, Monte Carlo SSs were everywhere. I had an 88 Monte SS T-tops. I had the burgundy color with the you know, the red interior, which was the most common color. And I would tell you again, for me, on the Montes, 87 to 88 are the way to go. They had the better wheels, kind of the IROC style wheels. They got away from the Steelies they had in the earlier version. A little more horsepower, not a ton. They were still like 185 horse. But with the rear ends they had, and those cars had like 355s or 373s, really good performance off the line. They took great modifications. You know, again, easy enough with that engine bay to throw in a bigger motor. I saw a bunch back in the day with 383s, and I've seen the taillights of some 383s back in the day. But what a cool looking car. Now, I'm kind of in the minority. I don't love the Aero Coupe from 87. I know they made that for NASCAR to kind of, you know, get through some of the win stuff with, you know, some of the stuff Bill Elliott was doing with, but I'm not a giant fan of that particular body style with the Aero Coupe. So for me, 87 to 88, the standard body coupe, and either white or that burgundy maroon color. Beautiful car. Got to get it with the T-tops. Got to get it with the, you know, the automatic on the console. You know, not on the column, right? That's the best looking version of that car with the red interior. So just a really cool, great looking car. And again, they were ubiquitous. They were everywhere back in the 80s. And you don't see a ton of them anymore because they kind of get used up. So anytime I see one at a show, I'm always excited to see it. But let's go on to number 11. Right, next up on our list, we have an iconic Ford. And I just talked about with the Monte Carlos, having to actually do something to try to compete with the Thunderbirds in the mid-80s that Bill Elliott was running. In 87, Ford came out with the Turbo Coupe. They had made the Turbo Coupe earlier, but it was a little bit of an underperformer. I actually really loved the 83 to 86 Thunderbirds with the 5.0, even though it wasn't rated as high as the Mustangs were. What a cool looking car. You could get the phone dial or 10-hole wheels on it with a 5.0, and that was a little bit of a sleeper. But in 87, Ford came out with the Turbo Coupe in the newer version, that more aerodynamic version with the updated styling. 190 horsepower, 5-speed, 145 mile an hour top speed. Motor Trend named it Car of the Year. Again, not a car you see a ton. They got used up. They were a transportation, but what an awesome car. And especially back in the time when you saw one. I remember high school, one of our teachers had one, and we were all like, this is just the coolest car ever. That really cool aerodynamic shape that Ford was going with. You saw that with the Taurus at the time. The Mustang also upgraded itself that year in 87, and you had that more rounded European style with the Mustang. So it's just kind of a cool time for some of those cars. But that Turbo Coupe, if I could find one today, or in all honesty, a really clean 85 or 86 5.0 Thunderbird with low miles, it'd be something I would absolutely get after. They're not a ton of money. You can still find them out there, but they're hard to find with low miles in great shape. But if you can, grab one because it's a really, really cool car. So on to number 10. Number 10. Here is a car that was incredibly unique, only out for 2 years, based on a car that sold everywhere. Again, everyone I knew growing up had a Cutlass, and it was kind of our first car. And this car on this list is going to be the 83 and 84 Hersolds. 2 years only, silver and black. They reversed colors after the 2 years. So the first year was the silver on top with the black on the bottom. The second year was the black with the silver on the bottom. Only powered by an old 307, like 170 horsepower. But the coolest thing about this car, it looked awesome, great graphics package. You could get the T-tops, but it had the Hurst lightning bolt shifters, which were this really cool setup where you could put it down into into drive, you'd pop it into first and second, and then you'd bang into second, you'd bang into drive, and you had this really cool drag strip type transmission in a street car that looked awesome. And if any of your friends had it, Eric, who I went to high school, had one. It was just painted white, right? It was badass. I remember coming home from the Army in my 5.0, and I see his Hersolds, and I love that car. And he was super honest with me. We were talking about racing. He's like, dude, you'd kill me. This car, they're not fast, but they were cool looking. And what it kills me is I should have pulled the trigger and bought them. 4 years ago, you could get one for 10 grand. Now you're looking at 30 to 40 for a really nice one. So again, a great investment car if you're looking for something kind of fun and different from the 80s to pick up on. But I love the car, and I think it's so cool. And again, the fact that Olds in the middle of the 80s would have the guts to put out an underpowered 307 V8 with the most cool transmission setup just speaks to what the 80s was about excess. So very, very cool. Now we're going to jump into the top 10. 9. A car that I came very close to owning as my first car. I talked about it a little bit on my most beautiful American cars video, but I'm going to talk about the late 80s Chevy IROC Z. If you don't know, IROC stands for International Race of Champions, and there was a whole series of cars that they were doing with Chevys where they'd have professional drivers driving essentially stock versions of these cars, so it was really based on what the drivers could do. Well, Chevy took advantage of this and created this really cool car through the mid to late 80s with the IROC Z, but the pinnacle of the IROC would have been that 87 to 88 era. Look, GM was doing a lot of cool stuff, but really they kind of hit their peak in that 87 through 89 where there was just some really cool stuff out there. And to me, the pinnacle of this car is a blue 87, T-tops, louvers on the back. Just a beautiful, cool car. Again, you saw them everywhere, but you knew when you saw an IROC, you wanted to get after it. And here's the thing that was crazy, and Chevy was pretty smart here. The 5.0 and the 5.7 looked basically identical on the outside, so you didn't know which version you were running up against. You couldn't get the 5.7 with a manual. You could only get it with the 5.0 because Chevy didn't want to have a car that could really rival performance of the Corvette for a lot less money. So that's the only downside to this car. But again, to find a really nice IROC today, very similar to Fox Body Mustang, money, you're looking at 25 to 30 for a nice low miles version. And again, I've been looking for a low mile blue, with T-tops and the louvers. So if I ever find one, it may become the next car in the Fox Body Phantom stable. But I absolutely love the car. So now we're gonna head over to number 8. All right, for number 8, I actually feel like I'm really underdressed. I should have on like a white blazer with like a pastel blue t-shirt, maybe some loafers with no socks. And anyone that grew up in the 80s knows exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the Ferrari Testarossa. What a cool car. Style is just amazing. All those side strakes. It is literally probably the most quintessential 80s car. If it's not, it's right up there with another car on this list. But when you think of the 80s, this is a car that you just envision. But here's the cool thing. Testarossa stood for redhead, and this was the color of the heads on the motor were red to kind of, celebrate an anniversary Ferrari that had also been called the Testarossa, had red heads. And it was like the ultimate GT car of the 80s. And what's funny is we will talk about the Countach later up on the list. From everything you've ever read or ever seen, this is a much better driving car. It's more comfortable. Like, everything is better about this car. But it hasn't quite gotten to the level of the Countach yet. Now, that being said, you're still looking at $500,000 to get a really nice one with low miles now, $300,000 to $500,000, which is absolutely insane. And their performance at the time was amazing. 180 miles an hour, 0 to 60 in the low fives. In the mid 80s, these were like, spaceship numbers that people couldn't believe. And again, when you see one, you always see them in red, but you think about the Miami Vice, when they had wrecked the fake Ferrari Daytona. Ferrari provided, the white, Testarossa, which just fit into that Miami scene at the time. The white, Don Johnson, what a cool car. And again, if you don't love a Testarossa, then you're not an 80s baby, because that car was just so cool. Number 7 is kind of a unique car. Porsche made some amazing 911s in the 80s, and I was actually never a giant 911 fan until I get a little older and started really respecting the performance of those vehicles. And then you saw the movie that came out with Charlie Sheen and D.B. Sweeney, No Man's Land, where he was actually stealing Porsches, and I'm like, oh, this is so cool, right? So, I love this car, and I thought it was cool, but then to me, the 911, the pinnacle was the 930 turbo, that slant nose, right? More aerodynamic, the turbo motor. They didn't make a ton of them. Again, this is a car that, again, screams the 80s. It was the one time that Porsche really took a gamble with the styling on their 911 and just changed that front end completely. You can get it in a standard version of the turbo version. And that turbo version was one of the fastest cars in the world. Again, when you start to read some of the stuff from Motor Trend and Car and Driver, I mean, it was, 0 to 60 in the fives. Road holding was amazing. Braking was the best in the world at the time. From 70, it was like 165 feet or something like that, which was unheard of at the time. So again, just a really cool, iconic Porsche. And I wanted to throw a 911 on the list, but to me, this was kind of the coolest version of that car. And again, I know purists will say it's not a 911, it's its own standalone model. And again, that's a different debate. Porsche's played this game with the 912s, the 911s, the 930s all over the years. But to me, again, they all kind of fall into that same family. And the coolest version for me was that 930 turbo. All right, so number 6 is the car that's in the name of this channel. And again, I'm trying not to have bias because I love this car. But it is one of the coolest and most important cars of the 1980s. And to me, it really falls in. Obviously, there's the 79 through 86. But then it really is the 87 through 93, which to me is the most important version of it. I'm going to go with that version. So let's call it the 88 through 90 because we're focusing on 80 cars here. Fox Body Mustang. This car changed the game for everything. 86 brought us in the electronic fuel injection. But in 87, you had the redone body style. In 87, you could still get T-tops. Man, I wish I could find an 87 T-top GT 5-speed 5.0. With electronic fuel injection and turbine wheels. To me, that's like the pinnacle of what that car could be. But I have my 88. Fast, fun, cool, like everything you think about. And then again, that car became iconic over the years with all the different, iterations of performance that you could do to it. All the modifications really brought the modification scene to the forefront with the Fox bodies. That was the first car that really became kind of that plug and play. And I live in both of those worlds, right? I have a Jeep and I have a Mustang, and both of those worlds are cars that are, super into modifications. And I think the Japanese car scene kind of followed a lot of what the American car scene did. And I'm going to give a lot of kudos to that Fox body Mustang from the middle of the 80s because I truly believe that it changed the game. And again, today, you want to pick one up, you can get a decent one for 15 grand, you can get a really nice one for 25 to 30. But I would tell you to buy one soon because I bought mine a year ago for under 20. And it's probably in the mid to high 20s right now if I were to sell it. So if you want to get one soon before the prices continue to go up. And now we're going to head on to our next car. Number 5, it's the most 80s car of the 80s. It is the Lamborghini Countach, Cannonball Run, every person's poster on their wall. Trapper Keepers, man, the Countach was everywhere, and it should be. It is the coolest looking car of all time still today. It's iconic. When you think of a supercar, you think of a Lamborghini Countach. It was fast. It was difficult to drive. You couldn't see out of it. Ergonomically, it was a disaster. None of the buttons made sense. It had all of the problems of an Italian car with all of the, the electronics and everything. But who cares? The wing, the Lamborghini doors, the styling, the crazy headlights, everything about this car just screams cool. And if you see one today, and I've been to Cars and Coffee where there's a Countach, and I've seen it sitting next to everything else out there. Ford GTs, newer Lamborghinis, Ferraris F40s, doesn't matter. If there's a Lamborghini Countach at an event, it will be the most popular car there, and people will be automatically drawn to that car because it just screams 80s. Now, again, if you're going to buy one, to me, you got to buy the 25th anniversary 89 in white with a red interior. I think it's the coolest thing out there. But here's the deal. If you want to buy one, you got to be willing to pony up between $500,000 and $750,000 now because that's what they're going for. Again, a car just a couple of years ago you could have got for probably 100, 150. The car market is crazy right now, so the Lambos are just way out of control. But again, this to me is the quintessential 80s car. All right, this is my list, and I'm going to cheat a little bit. So for number 4, there are 2 cars on this list. It is the Ferrari F40 and the Porsche 959. 2 completely different cars, but again, cars from the late 80s that were built to be competitive race cars, and they were built to one-up each other. And they were both, at the time, the fastest cars in the world. And again, when you think of cool cars from the 80s, you got to think about the technology, the Porsche 959, and then you got to think about the pure, unadulterated styling and bare bones performance that was designed into the F40. I'm not going to go a whole lot deeper. This is probably a video someday. Maybe I'll do a comparison between the two. There's a lot of really cool videos and articles on this, so I won't go too deeper into this, but understand that, you know, both of these cars will set you, you know, back well north of $2 million if you want to try to get one. You know, the 959 wasn't imported into the U.S., so now that it's old enough, it can be. But again, both of these cars just iconic. And when you think about performance icons of the 80s, these are probably the two biggest performance icons. And on the Formula Firebird, I talked about, I thought it was the second best looking Pontiac of the decade. And I stand by that because I think the coolest Pontiac of the decade, and my number 3 coolest car of the 80s, is the 89 Turbo Trans Am pace car that had the Buick Grand National GNX motor in it. 275 horsepower, you know, roughly 350 foot-pounds of torque. You can get it with or without T-tops, white only, with the gold accents, with the tan leather interior, the performance suspension package. I owned an 87 white GTA, white and gold. I loved the car, but it was a nightmare, had a ton of mechanical issues. But I thought this Turbo Trans Am was one of the coolest cars ever. And one of the coolest facts on this car, it was the first pace car that needed no modifications to actually set the pace for the race. So out of the box, it could actually handle the pace car duties on a racetrack without any modification. So I thought that was one of the coolest things I ever read about that car. Again, I kicked myself. These cars 5 years ago were 15 to 18 grand. Now they're $45,000 to $50,000 all day if you can find a low mileage version. But again, you're going to find one of the coolest cars ever. And kind of a sleeper because people don't really know much about that Turbo Trans Am, but it was a more aerodynamic, faster Grand National. So again, what else could you ask for? Just a cool, badass car. Now we head into our top 2 coolest cars of the 80s. All right, number 2 and number 1 were so close for me, but number 2 is going to be the Ferrari 288 GTO. I'm going to say something that I don't think I've ever heard people have heard me say because I'm an American car guy. To me, the Ferrari 288 GTO is the most beautiful car I have ever seen. I love the Ferrari 308 and 328 GTSs. They're really more common as the Magnum PI Ferrari. The 288 was built to actually allow Ferrari to go racing. They built less than 300 over like a 3-year window. The car was incredibly expensive at the time, but it was awesome. It was like an under a 3-liter twin turbo V8 making like 350 horsepower and 390 foot-pounds of torque. It was stupid fast. It was absolutely gorgeous. You'd only find it in the red. And I think out of all of the supercars, I saw one of the challenges where they brought a 288, an F40, an F50, an Enzo, and a LaFerrari. And obviously the 288 was the slowest car there by a wide margin. It didn't matter to me. Out of all those cars there, I would 1,000% take that 288 because for the time, the performance was still amazing. 0 to 60 in under 5 seconds, over 150 miles an hour. Great braking, great handling, and just the most beautiful sheet metal I've ever seen on a car. I still stand to this day. As much as I love the Ford GT, and I think the Ford GT is the best looking American car ever made, the Ferrari 288 GTO, in my personal opinion, is the best looking car ever made. And that's why it's number 2 on my coolest cars of the 80s. The only reason it's not number 1 is it's actually also a little bit forgotten, and because it looks so similar to the 308. Now, it's better looking in every aspect, but it kind of gets lost and it almost becomes a little bit of a sleeper. So for that reason, I have it number 2, but I don't have $2 million to buy one anyway, so it's kind of irrelevant. But I do want to talk about our number 1 coolest car of the 80s, and for me, should be no surprise. I haven't talked about it yet, and if you're an 80s child, the coolest car of the 80s, in my opinion, would have been the Buick Grand National / Buick GNX. And I'm specifically going to go the 86, 87 years where they had the newer version of the intercooler, a little more horsepower. One caveat on this, they only came in black. You have to get the cloth interior. The leather interior in this car looks terrible. It's like a brown and black, and it's just a weird color combination. The gray and black cloth interior with the Turbo 6 logo on the headrest is iconic. Gorgeous car. Fastest production car in America when it was made. It was faster than the Corvette. The GNX was a beast. They only made like 500. Those are going for over $100,000 right now. But to find a nice, clean, low-mile Grand National, you're looking in the 40s to low 50s, which blows my mind. Now, I still look at it all the time, and if I could find the right Grand National, I would trade in the Fox body for it and throw a little bit more cash, but it would have to be the right one with the right mileage that wasn't crazy expensive. It'd have to have T-tops. That would be a must for me. But that 87 Grand National, 87 GNX, amazing cars, incredibly cool, absolutely love them. So I hope you guys have liked this list. I love having some fun talking about the cars of this, and we're in the winter. You know, I'd love to be out driving my car today, but we still got probably 3 more months before it's going to come out of, you know, winter storage, so we can't do it. But we appreciate you checking out the channel. If you haven't done so far, please hit the like and subscribe button. I'll continue to do new videos. We'll try to put some more fun stuff out in the winter, talk about other cars, share other stuff with you. As always, thanks for checking out the channel. We hope you have an awesome day, and we'll talk to you soon.